happy Monday. Thank you for joining me for this week's Unlocking the Magic of Leadership. Now, this is going to be week 1 of our 4-week series about what we can learn from the current presidency. And I mentioned in last week's video, if you didn't see it, make sure and go back and check it out. I mentioned that we're going to be covering 4 different areas. So this week, the area that we're going to be covering is slow down so that we can move fast. There's going to be 3 tips that are going to be given throughout this video, along with some examples and stories that can help us understand what this means. Now, when I was a leader at Disney, it was a more challenging assignment. And so my group of cast members weren't necessarily gelling with me, and I wasn't gelling with them, and we needed to make it happen. And I knew as their leader, it was my responsibility to make those adjustments. Because
who is the only person that we can control? Ourselves.
And so if I wanted to be able to start making the difference that I was looking for, it had to start with me. I couldn't just wait on them to do it. And so I had a leader that told me that slow down to move fast. And I was like, huh? What's you talking about there, Willis? And they explained that before we can get people to be willing to let us work with and through them, they have to know that they can trust us. And trust isn't built overnight. It's something that's incrementally laid. And when they start seeing that there's consistency in your actions and you say what you mean and all of these different pieces, and you take that time to slow down, then you get everybody on board and you can move so much faster. And so to do that, to be able to slow down so you can move fast, the very first thing that we're going to talk about is pausing. So when you are in the midst of making changes, it's critical to pause and be strategic before you just execute. So when we think about Trump's first month in office, there was a lot of executive orders that were happening, and it caused a lot of confusion. And then Elon Musk comes on board and he starts rolling out that if you don't respond to this email, you're fired, and everybody has the option to leave government if they want and get paid for a certain amount of time.
And oh, but no, we're just kidding. You can't actually do that.
And it caused a lot of confusion, not only as to what people were and were not allowed to do and whether they were or were not going to get fired, but also who's actually making the decisions. And was it Musk? Was it Trump? Where is it coming from? Because if it's coming from Musk, then it's not an executive order. If it's coming from Trump, then right? And so when we're thinking through this, being strategic before we execute is really critical, especially when you start engaging with people's jobs and security and pay and all of these pieces. When I started at Disney, I had another leader that told me, you'll do fine if you don't mess with people's schedule or their pay. And I took that seriously because these are people's lives that you start pulling strings and they start feeling like a puppet. I haven't met a human being in existence that is comfortable feeling like a puppet. And so that very first thing that we can learn from this is to slow down, be intentional, and be strategic. Don't just go at it with 90 to nothing. Gotta slow down. And the second piece is along the same lines. How can we engage key stakeholders early? When we're making big, broad, sweeping decisions, how can we ensure that those that are going to be responsible for the change, those that are going to be on the front lines having to communicate this change, that they're on board? Because I'm sure as leaders, you've all had that experience where from the top, from the executives, is we're going to start doing this. And you're like,
Is that really the best idea? I'm not sure that's the best idea. And they're like, no, we're going to do it.
and then you're stuck with the responsibility of explaining it to your employees when you don't necessarily believe in it or you don't understand the why. And so when we're thinking through it, it's making sure that stakeholders are involved early. Now, the third and final tip is to iterate instead of overhauling. So when we think about, the example of all of the emails that have been going out to federal employees about whether they do have a job or whether they don't have a job, and they have to defend their job by responding. And if they don't respond, then they get fired. And they found that out through X, what most of us old people know as Twitter. And so when we're thinking about it, instead of having to roll out massive amounts of change and then backtrack on that change, it's how can we roll out slow, incremental change so that way the change has a much better rate of success, and we can also see where maybe it's not going to work. So there's been a lot of executive orders that are currently held up in the judicial system.
With judges going, I don't think you can do that, boo.
Maybe we should slow down and have a conversation, right? And so anytime a leader rolls something out and then there's a halt, it can cause a lack of trust. And a lot of people put a lot of energy into these changes and they're like, why am I doing what I'm doing? And so as leaders, being able to work with and through others is critical. And that trust aspect, if you don't have it, you're not only going to be going very slowly, you're going to have people that are actively working against you, against the progress that you're trying to create. And so when we think about it, the 3 tips for leaders for being able to slow down so you can move fast is pausing for strategy before execution, engaging stakeholders early, and then iterating instead of overhauling. So I hope that you have had an absolutely amazing week. And if you're going through massive amounts of change, which I know many of us are, I hope that this week was helpful. Now, next week, we're going to be looking at how can we align action and communication. We hinted at it a little bit in this video, but we're going to dive even deeper next week and also talk through what are some tips and tricks that you have that you'll be able to do this. All right. Thank you for joining me this week. And as always, don't forget, you got this. I'll see you next week.